Thank you so much for the great introduction and for inviting me. It's really my pleasure to be here to speak with all of you today. So I was born in India and I grew up in Singapore after that and moved to the US for high school. And after high school and college in Massachusetts, has anybody been to Boston here? Okay, so you know what the winters are like there. So with all the snow and everything, I had enough. And so I moved out west to San Francisco. And I've been there, almost 20 years. So I was at the University of California, San Francisco School of Medicine. And I did my family medicine training at Stanford. So became a family doctor. And also did a fellowship in integrative medicine with Andrew Weil at the University of Arizona. And in parallel, I began my Ayurvedic training at the Arya Vaidya Pharmacy in Coimbatore and studied with Dr. L. Mahadevan in Kanyakumari as well. So my whole purpose in life, I think, is really bridging ancient wisdom and modern science. And I think that we really need to integrate the best of our ancient knowledge with scientific wisdom, and I think that's the way to move our healing systems forward. And so my talk today is, I'm going to be constantly shifting between the Ayurvedic perspective and the Western medical perspective. And so we'll be going back and forth between Ayurvedic wisdom and modern science. And so we're going to talk about the gut, of course, and we're going to be correlating Agni with the microbiome and these concepts. And then and we'll see the remarkable similarities and parallels between both of them. And part two of my talk is going to be all about treatment, so how you can heal the gut, balance Agni, heal the microbiome, and really optimize the health of your patients. So, so how many people have heard of the microbiome? No, I'm pretty much sure everybody's heard of the microbiome. But so the numbers are really inconceivable. So about 100 trillion bacteria in your gut, and we have about 10 trillion human cells. So essentially, we're 90% bacterial and only 10% human. That's what we are. And thinking of this number is so huge. So if you lined up all the bacteria in your gut end to end, they would stretch all the way to the moon. And bacteria are really small, so that just gives you a sense of just how many there are. And in terms of genes, so we know that there's about 23,000 genes in the human body, and we know now that epigenetics, which is how genes are expressed, is much more important than the actual genes themselves. But still, when you look at the number of bacterial genes, there's well over 1 million, and so the connection between the genetic material as well, there's a huge discrepancy. And so what are some of the functions of the microbiome? So the first aspect is regulating metabolism. So this includes blood sugar regulation, weight regulation. So there's a big role in obesity, energy metabolism. They also protect against infections. So your gut bacteria are a big part of your immune system, how your body maintains its defenses. And then they, of course, have a huge role in digestion, in GI function, and also synthesis of certain key nutrients. So a number of B vitamins, biotin, thiamine, vitamin B12, these are all synthesized by your gut bacteria. So if you don't have the right balance, you're not making the right nutrients. Vitamin K2, also a key nutrient that we're just finding out about now. It's really not well known, but your gut bacteria are responsible for converting vitamin K1 to vitamin K2. Vitamin K1 is in tons of foods like spinach, leafy greens, all this stuff. But vitamin K2 is not found in many foods, but your bacteria should convert that for you. So, and of course, they have a big effect in regulating the immune system. So, educating your immune system. So, with the immune system, it's all about a Goldilocks level. Not too weak and not too strong, and somewhere in the middle. And that set point is really dictated by the gut bacteria. So, that's one of the reasons why there's such an epidemic of autoimmune disease. So, so how many people have heard of this concept, the leaky gut syndrome? Okay, so most people have, yeah. For those who haven't, essentially the gut lining should be an impermeable barrier. So if you think of the intestinal cells linked together like this, with basically interlocking fingers that should be no gaps between them, and those are the tight junctions which create those. And when they're not working properly, there are gaps which allow substances that leak into the bloodstream that are not supposed to, and that leads to things like toxins, bacteria, pathogens getting into your bloodstream that are not supposed to be there, and that leads to the immune system, marking these as foreign and attacking those things and becoming kind of hyperactive. So let's take one example of leaky gut, maybe the most extreme example, and that is celiac disease. So with celiac disease, we have on the left the picture of the healthy gut lining. So these are the villi. The villi are the finger-like projections, thank you, the finger-like projections in the intestine. And on the right, in celiac disease, what you have here is called villus atrophy. So basically, you can see those villi are totally blunted. They're gone. The surface area is really reduced. There's a lot of inflammation. And then that is one of the severe cases where there's a pretty marked leaky gut. And so you see that in this diagram, some of those things are slipping into the bloodstream that are not supposed to. So what are some of the causes of leaky gut syndrome? Well, there are a number of them. There's food sensitivities. For example, with gluten or dairy or other products. And with food sensitivities, I want to differentiate between celiac and NCGS, or non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So gluten sensitivity is a spectrum. And on the one end, you have celiac disease, which is the very severe end, which you can test with a blood test. But there are mild to moderate cases on the spectrum, which are missed by the blood test. And so, those can be measured with other tests. But are doctors checking for celiac here in the UK? Yeah, it's pretty common. Yeah. So you can check that with blood tests. But if you're only doing a blood test, you might miss the other range of the spectrum. The mild to moderate cases, and those can be measured with more specialized testing, stool testing, or elimination diet. Too much sugar, of course, has a harmful effect. Excess of alcohol. Infections can play a big role. And there's a large effect from various medications that are listed here. Antibiotics are one of the main things that also affect the gut microbiome in terms of the killing the good bacteria. So those are listed here. And then we have the factor of toxins. So with all the toxins in the environment, those have a harmful effect on the gut bacteria. They have a harmful effect on the gut lining. And for some reason, different people process them differently. So some people don't clear toxins as well, and those can accumulate to cause these effects. And of course, stress is a huge factor. So a couple of other things that are affecting the microbiome that are not mentioned here: the rise in cesarean sections. So then you have babies that are not getting seeded with a vaginal flora at birth, and then a reduction in breastfeeding, because breastfeeding is essential for developing the baby's microbiome at birth. And then other factors like rise in antibacterial soaps, hand sanitizers. We live in kind of an over sanitized world at this point. So this is, if you're wondering what the microbiome actually looks like, this is an actual picture from a research lab of the microbiome. So here on the left is the bacteria, and then this is the human the cells lining the gut microbiome, and then there's this green layer of kind of a barrier in between. So can anyone guess what is the green layer? Mucus, yeah. So actually there's a pretty thick layer of mucus that's supposed to be there, so the body has a defense against leaky gut, right? And that's the mucus layer. So I think of this as the kapha aspect of the microbiome, because it's a protective structure that the body creates, so it's part of you. And this is our main defense against leaky gut, is actually this mucus layer. So what is the main food for the gut bacteria? What do they eat?
Fermented food?
Fermented foods? No. Those have bacteria. Fiber, yeah, they eat fiber. Yeah, exactly. They eat fiber. So why does that matter? Well, if you look at evolution, And I always like to take an evolutionary perspective, in my work. So for hundreds of thousands and millions of years, we actually had a very high fiber diet. So if my whole approach with the paleo diet is that it's a plant-based diet, because that's really what our ancestors ate. Even the hunter-gatherer societies, they've been found to have about 100 to 150 grams of fiber per day. That's what we evolved with in terms of what our bacteria expect, what they need. And then agriculture is a relatively recent invention, about 10,000 years ago, if you look at human history. So at that point, average fiber intake dropped a great deal to about 35 grams or so. And then we have our modern, processed Western diet, which on average is about 15 grams. So it's about a 90% drop in the fiber, in the food for these bacteria. So why does that matter? Well, what happens on a low fiber diet, which is kind of the modern Western diet? So this is a study that illustrates it really well. On the left here is kind of a high fiber regular diet. And on the right is what they call a MAC deficient diet. So MAC is microbiome accessible carbohydrate. So it's a diet that has those key fibers. So if you take those out of the diet, this is what happens. So here on the right you have this is the gut lining. The yellow things are fiber, so that's undigested fiber. That's what the bacteria are feeding on. And in blue you have the subject, the host. And so you can see here a very healthy ecosystem here with a lot of fiber, a lot of bacteria in red. It's a little bit hard to see, but basically, a lot of food for the bacteria. So when you change to a regular low fiber diet, it kind of becomes a wasteland. There's hardly any fiber in terms of the yellow particles. The bacteria are much more limited. So when they don't have that food, what do the bacteria eat? Mucus. That's right. So they actually begin to consume your mucus lining. I think the first thing is a lot of them die because they don't survive, they don't have the food they need, but those that remain actually begin to consume your mucus layer. And so essentially this is like they're eating part of you. And so it's clear that if you're not feeding your bacteria correctly and optimally, they will begin to eat you alive. That's essentially what's happening. And so it just highlights the importance of feeding the gut bacteria correctly. And I think the two main changes in the gut microbiome, in modern times versus ancestral times. Number one is a loss of bacterial diversity. So huge reduction. So the more diverse your microbiome, the healthier your gut is and the healthier you are. And each type of bacteria feeds on a different kind of fiber. So when they looked at these paleo societies, one of the main differences between what they eat and what we eat is the diversity of plant foods. So typical, paleo ancestor might have eaten 20 different kinds of fruits and vegetables and plant foods in a day. And when they've looked at modern Western diets, people are lucky if they get that in a year. 20 different kinds of fruits and vegetables. And so there's every different type of fiber feeds a different bacteria. So the huge drop in our diet diversity has led to the drop in microbiome diversity. And then another big change is the shift in the microbiome from fiber-consuming bacteria to mucus-consuming bacteria. So they've actually shown that the changes in our microbiome are favoring those species that are actually directly feeding on us. And so that's what we're kind of dealing with. So I don't want to overstate this, but I think this is one of the central health problems of our time. Perhaps one of the most fundamental problems in terms of the change in the gut microbiome and the rise in chronic diseases. So, so going back to leaky gut, when we look at the, once that mucus layer is compromised and you have bacteria and food particles getting through, then what happens is your immune system starts attacking those undigested foods or improperly digested foods, and you get food intolerances. So, have you ever had a client that is just kind of sensitive to every food and allergic to every food? Have you worked with those people? Yeah. So you can be certain that they do have some degree of leaky gut because of the mechanism of how food intolerances develop. So, what are the symptoms of leaky gut? Well, I think the first thing to remember is there may not be any symptoms. So a person may not feel anything in the early stages. But as it becomes more severe, you might have GI symptoms. There can be changes in energy. The inflammation that results can lead to aches and pains, joint pain, muscle pain, those kind of things. Headaches, skin issues as well. So I think there's some key things to remember, which is the gut-skin axis. So the connection between the gut bacteria and your skin is hugely important. And there's also the gut-brain axis, which we heard about yesterday, because there's such a huge role of the microbiome in gut health and a bidirectional communication. And then there's also the gut-heart axis. So we know that the #1 cause of death worldwide is heart disease, right? And increasing evidence shows that the gut microbiome plays a big role in that because of the effect of through the gut-heart axis in terms of directly affecting heart function. So, but in the early stages, the symptoms can be quite mild. And I think as Ayurvedic practitioners, just assessing as we all do, a person's digestion, their bowel movements, their bowel habits, that's a fairly good way to get a rough idea how is their microbiome. So now coming to the Ayurvedic perspective, this is from the Ashtanga Hridaya, and the signs and symptoms of ama are clogging of channels, sense of heaviness, low energy, lethargy, indigestion, congestion, loss of taste, sexual debility. So you can see that the symptoms of ama in Ayurveda are very similar to the symptoms associated with leaky gut in modern science. So what are some of the conditions that are linked to leaky gut and imbalances in the microbiome? Well, there's a large number. I just want to highlight a few. Diabetes. So we know that because of the role of the microbiome in regulating blood sugar and metabolism, there's a huge effect on diabetes as well, which is really an epidemic. And then what's the fastest growing category of disease worldwide? Cancer? No, surprising. It is. That's growing a lot. But it's actually autoimmune disease, yeah. So autoimmune disease, unfortunately, is the fastest growing. Cancer is growing. There's a lot of diseases that are growing. But the fastest growing category is autoimmune disease, which a lot of these are. And we know that one of the biggest factors in autoimmune disease is the gut microbiome because of the role it plays in the immune system. I also want to highlight autism. So rates are really skyrocketing. And I work with children as well in my practice, so I see adults and children. And I think it's very rewarding, to work with children because they respond so much more quickly and they don't have all the emotional baggage, of adults. But with autism as well, there's many factors, but gut health and leaky gut is one of the key factors. So you can see the large number of lists, which is the partial list. I would also add heart disease to this list, because of the connections with leaky gut and the gut-heart connection. And sometimes issues with cholesterol as well can be caused by leaky gut and that kind of thing. And that's, of course, one of the risk factors for heart disease. So there's many ways that the gut-heart connection affects heart disease. And if there are questions, I'm going through this fairly quickly, so just stop me as I'm going through if anybody has any questions.
Yeah. Is the appendix, because I understood that many people, they take the appendix out, and then that can, so how the appendix is actually connected to the production of good bacteria?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so it's thought that the appendix is kind of like a resource, if you will, where a lot of the bacteria are stored, and there's a collection of them. And the cecum, which is also near the appendix, is one of the highest concentration of bacteria in the intestine. So, so it's true, like removing the appendix in surgery, probably impairs the microbiome to some extent because you kind of lose that reservoir. So, if you, for example, take a course of antibiotics, when your gut repopulates, it's thought the appendix plays a role. So those people would have a much harder time recovering from antibiotics or other things. So.
Question about fiber is
Yep.
Clients that have these kind of issues find fiber difficult to digest.
Yes,
So
exactly. Yeah, absolutely. So it's a huge challenge because that's what they need, but at the same time they can't handle it because of how upset their Agni is and how imbalanced their gut is. So I think, we'll talk in the second part about how to treat this whole mess. So we'll come back to that. Yeah.
Just a question on the food sensitivities, because you mentioned it as a cause and an effect
Right.
of leaky gut. So how does the initial food sensitivity start, apart from celiac, because obviously has a genetic component? What's your view on how that comes about?
Well, that's it's a very complex question, actually. I think, let's just take one example with gluten. So if we look at our food supply, it's also changed a lot in the past 100 years. So if you look at wheat, I'm not even talking about GMOs, genetically modified food, which are totally bigger issue. But the amount of gluten in wheat has increased about 40-fold in the last 100 years. 40, yeah, and also the dwarf wheat was the type of wheat that was grown, 100 years ago, but it's been bred to be much more productive, much more, larger, and so those changes just in breeding of wheat have led to changes in the proteins of wheat, the amount of gluten. So our food supply is also changing dramatically, and so a lot of the foods that we're eating, are quite different, and so our body doesn't recognize a lot of them, and that might be the initial trigger, and then you start getting the cycle with leaky gut. So speaking of the actually the cycle of leaky gut, so I think a lot of these cases, like with autoimmune disease, there's the disease itself causes further inflammation, and that leads to further problems with absorption of nutrients and further dysregulation of the immune response. And so it is kind of a cycle with leaky gut, but we're going to talk about how to halt that and reverse it. Okay, so we're going to switch gears and now put on our Ayurvedic hats, and so begin by talking about Agni, and so Agni, of course, is it's the digestive fire, but it's much bigger than that. It's the process of transformation. So there are about 40 main types of Agni in the body described in Ayurveda, and I'm going to begin with focusing on the Jatara Agni. So basically, the Agni in the stomach and small intestine. So when that's of course the main Agni in the body that sets the tone for all the other Agnis. And when you have a balanced or Sama Agni, you have an optimally functioning Jatara Agni, and that is the kind of goal in terms of having really optimal state of digestive health. So just to review, the three imbalanced forms of the Jatara Agni are correlating with the three doshas. So you have the Vishama Agni, which is when there's a Vata imbalance, when it's too dry, irregular, variable, and that produces a Vata-genic ama, so ama that's more likely to cause Vata disorders. And then you have the Pitta imbalanced Agni, which is Tikshna Agni, which is too hot, sharp, more quick, more prone to diarrhea. So these are the people who are having loose stools, diarrhea, and maybe their appetite is so high that they get very irritable when they're skipping meals or late for a meal. They can have sweet cravings because their body's trying to balance that that Agni that's Tikshna. And then you have the Manda Agni, which is the Kapha aspect where it's very too wet in quality, very slow, weak, inefficient, and that produces the kaphagenic ama and predisposes to kapha disorders. So just to review, we're going to correlate this with leaky gut, but the 6 stages of pathogenesis. So when you have the sanchaya, that's the accumulation of the doshas and ama, so in their original seat. And then in prakopa, they are vitiated or imbalanced. And then in prasara, that imbalanced ama and dosha spreads systemically, spreads from its seat systemically. And then in sthana samshraya, it's localized in the specific tissue or dhatu that's going to be affected. Finally, you have vyakti, so the first stage when there are symptoms, the manifestation of disease, and then beda is the when you start getting complications. So let's look at this in more detail. So we know that ama is formed in the GI tract and then enters the circulation. So from there, it can affect Agni in the liver. So everything that's released from the GI tract is processed through the liver. In Western medicine, that's what we call first-pass metabolism. So in Ayurveda, let's talk about the liver Agnis. So these are the Bhuta Agnis, the 5 main Agnis which are located in the liver. And this relates to the Pancha Mahabhutas, the 5 elements. So your digestive process breaks down food into the 5 elements, and then that comes to the liver. And the 5 Bhuta Agnis then further process those components. And so it's only when those are being optimally processed by the liver that goes into the circulation, and then you have the Dhatu Agnis. So the 7 Dhatu Agnis, which then process those into their components. And remember, with Dhatu Agnis, it's sequential. So you're starting with Rasa, Rakta, and so forth. And then you, at the final stage after Shukra Dhatu Agni, then you have Ojas, which is produced, the final endpoint of digestion. So I think that the liver Agni is really crucial here in healing leaky gut. And the reason for that is that all of our livers are pretty overloaded these days because of the toxins in our modern world. There's 70,000 toxins in the world, and in the air, water, food, and these are chronic low-level sort of things, but over time, it's the liver that every single day has to deal with those. And so I believe that the liver Agni is often weakened, because of this, and that makes it much harder then for it to produce the right elements from the gut that it's taking in. And I had one of my teachers who told me, he said that every patient is a walking liver until proven otherwise. And I kind of took that to heart because I think if you have a very difficult client, you're not sure where to start, I would start with the liver. And that's what we're gonna start with in the part 2 where we're talking about treatment. So so coming back to the pathogenesis then, so when ama is circulating, it finds the kavaigunya, which is the defect or the weakest area in the dhatu. So every person has a different kavaigunya, and that's why the same mechanism leads to many different diseases depending on the doshas and the dhatus and the kavaigunya. So we're going to look at amavata in a bit more detail. So traditionally, it's thought of as a Vata disorder, where Agni develops into Vishama Agni, and there's typically more irregular metabolism, and then the Vata-genic ama is produced, and that leaves the GI tract and then travels to the dhatus. And in rheumatoid arthritis, this is where the kavaigunya is in the joints. So the ama penetrates and covers the cells lining the joints. And as a result, the immune system doesn't recognize the ama-covered cells, that are lining the joints, and then that's what begins the process of immune attack in rheumatoid arthritis. And as that progresses, you have inflammation causing swelling and, pain in the joints, and over time it leads to joint erosions and deformity, in the later stages. So this is just one example of how this process occurs with the condition of rheumatoid arthritis. So we're going to talk next about the subtle essences of Ayurveda and how they play a role in some of these diseases. So those are, of course, Tejas, Ojas, and Prana. And Tejas you can think of as cellular intelligence, cellular metabolism. Ojas we talked about, that's the final endpoint of digestion after all the Dhatu Agnis process what the Bhuta Agnis in the liver have processed, and after your Jatara Agni has begun the process. And so that's the connection with immunity, vigor, and vitality, of course. Your Ojas is that reserve. And then the Prana, of course, is responsible for anything movement-related, Vata-related, like circulation, digestion, all of those things. So when you look at some of the traditional perspectives on autoimmune disease from Ayurveda, it's thought to come from an overactive Tejas that burns the Ojas aspect. And that leads to a disrupted cellular intelligence. And you might find that Vata and Pitta Prakritis are more prone to autoimmune disease. And that's because one of the reasons is that Tejas is similar in qualities. So the qualities of Vata and Pitta are similar to the qualities of Tejas. And so again, when the ama covers the cell membranes or lines the cell, that's what disrupts the immune system, because then the immune system doesn't recognize those cells, and it produces antibodies, which you can think of as a specialized form of Tejas. But in this case, the antibodies actually are destroying the cells. So before I go on, any questions? Because I'm going to cover some little bit more complex concepts at this point.
Could I ask you just
Yeah.
to step a little bit forward?
Oh, sure. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Well, then we can see anything.
Oh, okay. Well, all right. Okay. No worries. Yeah. That was an easy one. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So going on, talking about the antibodies. So this is something called, in modern science, we call the Antigen-Antibody Complex. And so in my view, this is an aspect of ama. So we're going to correlate this with the Ayurvedic concept of ama. So an antigen is basically any type of protein that enters the body. It could be human or it could be bacterial. And then so that's what's pictured in yellow here, the antigen. And then the antibody is what's the immunoglobulin that's produced by your immune system. So that is produced in response to antigens. So the antigen enters, and then your immune system produces the antibodies, and then they form these complexes, which are called antigen-antibody complexes, also known as immune complexes. And it can be part of the normal immune response, but it's implicated in various diseases that we're going to talk about. So one of the, so again, we're just in our regular modern scientific understanding here. This is a well-established disease known as post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis. So this occurs after strep infection, which is what causes strep throat. So it's the group A bacteria. And then the immune system produces the antibodies against those bacteria. And the immune complexes are formed with those antigens. And then, but the problem with this condition is it doesn't stop there. These immune complexes circulate, and then if they affect the kidney, depositing in the kidney, they can lead to glomerular damage and this condition of glomerulonephritis. So this is one of the complications of bacterial infection with strep disease. So just keep this in mind. We're going to come back to that. Now let's take the example of lupus. So lupus is also a disease where immune complexes play a really big role. So you have the genetic predisposition, and then it's been shown that leaky gut is definitely a factor. And there might be other factors as well, such as environmental exposures, infections. So that leads to these immune complexes as well that are produced. And in lupus, it's the antigen-antibody complexes that deposit in various tissues that's what causes the damage. So when they deposit in the kidney, again, you have the lupus nephritis. When they deposit in the joints, it's the arthritis of lupus. And so this inflammation, the immune complexes can affect various organs, and that's what leads to the damage in lupus complications. Okay, so these are fascinating correlation with the microbiome. So these next couple of slides are some of the key slides in my presentation. So in this one, you have, so remember when we were talking about the Ayurvedic pathophysiology, we were talking about how Ama leaves the GI tract and travels to the Dhatus, wherever the Kava Gunya is. Well, this is a perspective on that from the microbiome. So here you have the blue lining, which is the mucus layer. And then once you have the thinning of the lining over here, you have tendency towards leaky gut. And then these are the bacterial antigens, which are pictured here. So you have the leaky gut, and then you have the antigens coming through into the circulation. This is the gut lining, the intestine here. The gut lining is here, and then through leaky gut, the antigens are coming in. And then, as you know, the immune system will produce antibodies. So you'll have the immune complexes, that are produced, and then the entire immune complex translocates to the remote tissue, whether that's in the kidney or the joint, and this is how the inflammation and damage occurs. So when you think about how Ama leaves the GI tract and goes to the Dhatu, I think through the microbiome and leaky gut, you get a different picture of the same process that's occurring. So let's put these together in terms of the Ayurvedic pathogenesis and the correlation with allopathic and Western medicine. So in Ayurveda, you begin with the imbalances in Agni, and from the Western medical perspective, it's leaky gut syndrome. And so then you have the sanchaya, or the accumulation of, in Ayurveda, Ama. So you have Ama that develops. And in leaky gut, you have the antigens that translocate, go into the blood, react with antibodies, form the immune complex. And so the Ama is correlated with the immune complex. And then you have the circulation through the blood, or the prasara, or the spread, into the systemic circulation. And so the systemic, the GI Ama becomes systemic Ama, and then that penetrates the Kava Gunya, so the defect in the Dhatu. And from the Western perspective, the immune complex deposits. So it's circulating through the blood, and then it deposits in the affected tissue. And then you have the vyakti, or the manifestation, the activation of the immune system, and that's what produces inflammation. So we know that inflammation is the root of most modern disease, and so you see that this is kind of the common pathway here. That's both processes lead to that in terms of the Agni imbalance and the leaky gut, and then finally you have the complications. So you have the Veda from the Ayurvedic perspective, and from the scientific perspective, inflammation activates cytokines. So these are the immune markers we heard about yesterday, like interleukin-6 and other things, chemokines, cytokines. So those are drawn to the area because of the inflammation, which is the first step. And then that's what leads to the tissue damage, the organ failure, the complications. This is kind of the end stage of disease. But it all begins with imbalances in the Agni and imbalances in the gut and the microbiome. So what do we do about it? So my approach is I call the 5R protocol. So restore, remove, replace, re-inoculate, and repair. And I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because in my book I talk extensively about this, but I just want to highlight the main points. So we start with the liver. So number one is restoring optimal liver function. because not only because the Bhuta Agnis or the liver Agni is typically impaired, but because in the second phase, when you're going to be killing pathogenic organisms, the die-off again is going to go to the liver. So if the liver is not functioning well, it's going to be overloaded. And then you can have what's called a Herxheimer reaction, where people feel terrible because of this die-off that's happening. So what are some ways to support liver functions? So cooked cruciferous vegetables, lightly steamed, broccoli, cauliflower, all of those. Too much raw crucifers can dampen the Agni and also affect the thyroid because they're goitrogens, goitrogenic foods. And then one of my favorite foods is the beet greens, so the leafy tops of the beetroot. These are very good for the liver, rich source of trimethylglycine, which is one of the main things that supports methylation. This is a process in the body that is key for detox. And beets are the only food that have betalains, which is a phytochemical that increases the activity of glutathione, which is one of the main antioxidants, one of the main keys for phase 2 liver detox. So beets upregulate your own glutathione to help with liver detoxification. And in Ayurveda, we have a lot of benefits in terms of herbal options. So people recognize this? Manjishta? Yeah, exactly. So yeah, Manjishta is one of the best liver purifiers. I also use Bringaraj a lot. So Bringaraj is not only good for the head and good for hair, but also excellent liver tonic. I think the most well-known liver formulas often include Bhumya Malaki, which is very powerful for liver health. So so I'm not going to spend too much time, unfortunately, because of limited time. But there's a lot of options in terms of strengthening the liver.
What's your opinion about the very popular liver detox then?
Oh, the liver cleanses where you're trying to
Where you
like
drink olive oil with
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of those. I think, yeah, I know. Yeah, we always want a quick fix, right, in the West. But no, I mean, I think a more gradual approach is really best. So I think, using foods, using spices, using herbs, that's really what I would recommend. So I'm not a big fan of those. I do, yeah. So very rarely would I really recommend those. Okay, so step 2 is removing the bad stuff. So this is things such as, in toxic foods, food sensitivities, maybe doing an elimination diet with your clients, and then also clearing up intestinal infections. So you might use certain herbs depending on what's there. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but the first step is determining if there is a microbial overgrowth. Is it bacterial, is it fungal, is it viral? And then there's a lot of options in terms of wonderful herbs from Ayurveda. So there, I use golden seal, quite a lot. That has a high level of berberine. It's natural, antibacterial. Uva ursi, of course, is an excellent option as well. And neem is one of the most broad antimicrobial, so these should all be blended, of course, with other herbs. That's kind of beyond what we have time to discuss today. But there's also great antiparasitic herbs. Garlic is a great antiparasitic. Clove, which is not listed on here, but it's great for parasite eggs, for killing those. Artemisia is another one that's a great option, which is also an antifungal. So there's a lot of options, but step 2 is basically kind of cleaning out the gut in terms of removing the food sensitivities, doing an elimination diet, removing the pathogens, which are the bacterial, parasitic, viral, those types of things. So you want to first support the liver so it's strong enough to handle the second phase. And then in the third phase, you're replacing the good stuff. So the essential nutrients, whether they be digestive enzymes, hydrochloric acid, or bile salts. So we'll just take one example, which is the hypochlorhydria, so low stomach acid. So basically, the Jatara Agni is responsible for producing stomach acid, and when that is imbalanced, you can have low hypochlorhydria, and there could be various symptoms of that. So constipation, gas, bloating right after meals, indigestion, pernicious anemia, that's by definition, low stomach acid, and then heartburn. So many times in the West, it's thought that heartburn is from too much stomach acid, but actually it can often be triggered by low stomach acid also. And the reason for that is that stomach acid triggers your lower esophageal sphincter to close. And so if your stomach acid drops, that lower esophageal sphincter, which connects the esophagus to the stomach, opens, and then the reduced acid begins to reflux. And so it's actually the first step was a low stomach acid that led to heartburn. And then if you're doing eye exams, sometimes in the iris, a dark area around the border of the iris can be a sign of low stomach acid. So that's something to look for. And there's a lot of nutrient deficiencies as well that can contribute to this. So many of these key minerals and nutrients are responsible for helping your body produce stomach acid. And one of the best ways to counteract that is our Ayurvedic recommendation, chew ginger and dipped in lemon juice before the meals, bitters, especially bitter herbs or bitter tonics, before meals. There's Swedish bitters, Angostura bitters, there's bitter herbs. You can also consider digestive enzymes, so either plant-based or animal-based enzymes that support digestion. Apple cider vinegar before meals can also be helpful. So there's a lot of different ways to support someone's enzyme production and help boost that in the third phase. And then the fourth phase is re-inoculating. So you're restoring the bacteria. So, I could talk for 2 hours about how to do this, but the short version is that you want to have plenty of both soluble and insoluble fibers, which are the two main types of fiber. Try to get people to eat fruits and vegetables they don't normally do, because that will build diversity. Fermented foods are really key, so that's helpful because those have good bacteria. Human beings evolved eating fermented foods for forever. So this is a good, safe way to introduce more bacteria into our gut. And then studies have shown that actually eating fermented foods, you're getting the bacteria from the food, but you're also activating more of your own bacteria within the intestine. So it's thought that fermented foods create an environment in the gut that is favorable to allow new species to come forward. So it's not just the bacteria in the food you're getting, you're actually activating new species of bacteria from your own microbiome through the consumption of fermented foods. So those are actually very beneficial. And a key thing is really starting small. So I have many clients who can't tolerate, they can't tolerate sauerkraut or kimchi or kefir, but the key there is starting very small, like 1 teaspoon of kefir a day, like a quarter teaspoon per day. These are patients who are very sensitive, that you have to start that slow and build up gradually for their tolerance. So resistant starch, certain legumes have it. Potatoes, regular potatoes, if you cook them and then chill them for 24 hours in the fridge, they form resistant starch, so like a potato salad or something like that. And you can heat them up the next day, so you don't want to have it cold from the Ayurvedic perspective, but you don't lose the resistant starch. If you heat the potatoes the next day, they will still have that beneficial starch, which is a prebiotic. So prebiotic is basically food for the good bacteria, and the probiotics, like in fermented foods, are the actual bacteria. So prebiotic foods, I have a whole list in my book, but there's asparagus, Jerusalem artichoke, there's garlic, onions, leeks. So there's tons of prebiotic foods. Resistant starch is a prebiotic. All of these different types of legumes and tubers are also prebiotic. And fermented foods are a key part as well. And then you can consider supplements. I always like to emphasize food first, but for some people, you may want to use an actual probiotic capsule. You may want to use that for a short term to really raise the levels of the bacteria. So the final phase is repair. So you've done these 4 phases, you've re-inoculated, so you want to repair the gut lining. So how do we do that? Well, from the food perspective, there's some key foods. There's bone broth, which is rich in amino acids, gelatin, glycine. There's, of course, the fermented foods like fermented kefir, yogurt, sauerkraut and kimchi. You also want to have the good fats. So fat is really key for the gut lining to repair. Coconut oil, very, very good option in terms of providing good fats. Fish that have omega-3s like salmon, sardines, mackerel. And then for vegetarians, you can use ground flax seeds, chia seeds, in moderation. Don't go overboard. But these are providing the vegetarian options for omega-3s. So good fats, bone broth if they're open to it. So if they're vegetarian, these are some of the options for vegetarians. So L-glutamine is available just as a powder, glutamine powder. So glutamine is an amino acid. So it's a protein that is one of the main foods for your enterocytes, which are the cells lining your GI tract. So you're giving them their preferred fuel and allowing them to regenerate. So your gut lining regenerates every 3 weeks. So every 3 weeks, normal gut lining repairs. So as long as you're taking out those harmful, foods or harmful bacteria, all those things, and creating the right environment, your own gut lining can really repair itself. It does that. It renews every 2 to 3 weeks. So L-glutamine is a good option. Butyrate. So butyrate is a fat. It's one of the short-chain fatty acids. And this is found in certain foods like grass-fed butter, grass-fed ghee, is also a good option, and if it's also available in capsule form. So butyrate is one of the foods that also helps with repairing those tight junctions. So the tight junctions are one of the key things that's broken down in leaky gut. So butyrate helps repair the tight junctions. So it helps with sealing the leaky gut. You can use either L-glutamine or butyrate, and then there are various herbs like the demulcent herbs. Aloe, marshmallow, slippery elm, licorice that help in terms of healing the gut. So, so you really want to do this at the end, because if you're giving somebody butyrate and you haven't, taken out you haven't supported the liver, or you haven't taken out the parasite or the pathogen, then the same process is just going to repeat. They're going to repair the gut, but you have to. That's why it's sequential. You have to kind of go through the right order, the right stages. So any questions so far? 5 minutes, okay. Got it. All right. Oh yes.
Through the decolonization of the gut, at some point, could you just share your view on how it relates to the psychology and the mood and the emotion?
Oh, perfect. Yes, great segue. Yes, yeah, that's great. Yeah. So, that's a huge topic, and absolutely because of the gut-brain axis, there's a huge effect in terms of symptoms. People feel depressed or anxious or all sorts of things that could be coming from the gut microbiome. So stress is really a key factor here, and that's why all of the wonderful practices that we have in Ayurveda are really crucial. And with Agni, we didn't get time to talk about this, but because it's the process of transformation, there's also the emotional Agni, and there's emotional ama too. And so whenever there's stagnation of emotions, blockage, lack of processing, that is where you develop emotional ama. And I believe that has a huge impact in most chronic diseases as well. So I think you have to approach the person holistically and definitely address that aspect. So just in concluding, I think starting with the gut and starting with the liver specifically is always a safe way to go if you're not sure where to begin. I think integrating some perspectives from Ayurveda and Western science is a really powerful combination. And of course, you're always customizing to Prakriti and Vikriti. And then, Dinacharya as well is hugely important. I can't emphasize that enough. I think that daily routine, the circadian rhythms, those are really crucial, because actually the microbiome has a circadian rhythm too. So it's most active at night while you sleep, and it has its own pattern. So, every cell in every organ has its own circadian rhythm. So regulating that daily routine, dinacharya, these are like so powerful, these practices. So I know I talked a lot about the gut, but I think there's so many other things which we know about in Ayurveda, and when you put all of them together, that's a really powerful combination, to help people. So this is a picture of my daughter, she was eating a pomelo here, and just a reminder that healthy eating should be fun, and you want to remind people to use all of their senses when they're eating. So I learned a lot from her because she's always using all of her senses to explore a new food. It's like she's having it for the first time, smelling it, touching it, rolling it around on the floor, and then seeing how that affects the taste, like all this stuff. And so just a reminder, that should be emphasized with clients, that eating should be fun, and cooking is crucial, as well, and that's should not be neglected. So so just in terms of my book, I want to mention that with paleo, my whole approach is a plant-based diet. So it's not what the media portrays as paleo, which is just burgers and meat. That I don't think that's what our ancestors ate. Our ancestors ate primarily, leaves, tubers, like very starchy tubers, roots, berries, fruits, legumes. So these were all. So my approach to paleo is much more broad. A lot of paleo books exclude legumes and exclude all grains, and I think that's too extreme. I think we need a moderate kind of approach. And the reason why I combined paleo and Ayurveda is I think both are sources of ancient wisdom. With paleo, we look at millions of years of history of how we lived, how we ate, how we lived in tune with nature, and there's so much we can learn from that to counteract the stresses of modern life. Because the main problem with modern life is it's what's called evolutionary mismatch. Where our genes are totally mismatched to our modern life, our modern daily routine, our food, our stress, our sleep, our lack of community, all those things. So, and then of course, the Ayurveda, the ancient wisdom, there's so much that it has to offer. And so I found putting those together to be a good combination. So thank you all for your patience and your time, and I'll be happy to take any other questions. Yeah.
According to Ayurveda, it's like when you take lots of salt and food,
Yes.
it stimulates, it causes rectal vitiation.
Yes.
So have you noticed any relation? How is there any stage that you cannot take this from this point of view?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know that it's controversial in Ayurveda. There's some negative effects of fermented foods as well. So you definitely have to factor that in the whole process. I think depending on how someone's pitta is, I think that's a good kind of judge. And if they have excess pitta, you don't want to start with the fermented foods. I think you want to start with other ways to heal their Agni. If they have Tikshna Agni, you probably don't want to start with fermented foods. You want to use the other elements, maybe more cooling foods, cooling herbs, spices that are more cooling, fennel, coriander, those kind of things. And then the fermented foods might be introduced only later, or maybe not. Maybe you use the prebiotic foods. Maybe you use probiotic capsules versus fermented foods. So I think you have to really customize it to the Prakriti and the Vikruti.
And so if you buy probiotic, what would you go for? Because they have like different. Which would you go for? Like acidophilus is kind of the common one.
Okay.
So what would you say? Because it's very difficult to choose which.
Yeah. Okay, well, how many hours do we have?
No,
I'm just kidding. No, it's a good question. No, it's a great question, but it's just such a complex topic. Yeah, because our understanding of the microbiome is really in its infancy. And with probiotics, most of them are, they're out of your system in 2 weeks. So when you take a probiotic, it's in your system, but then when you stop, typically they don't colonize. They are, kind of washed out and gone after 2 weeks. But that doesn't mean they have no effect. They often have a huge effect. modulating the immune system. They seem to have a role more as immune modulators rather than just strictly the bacteria themselves. So Acidophilus is one of the main bacteria in the gut microbiome. But I think with probiotics, I would suggest there is research on what are the forms that are most effective. So I would suggest kind of using that as a guide at this point.
Yeah. I had two quick questions. Just fecal transplants
Yeah.
was the other one I'd be interested in your opinion. And I love your book, and I was reading on a plane, and a rather overweight Romanian chap took a picture because he just said, "This is the book I need." It's very much consumer level, and that's what's so brilliant about it. But will you write a practitioner level book to get GPs interested and pharmacists? And practitioners
thanks.
As well?
Oh, thanks.
Using
It's
this
on.
sort of language, because I think it's just really exciting.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's on my list for sure. What was your first question?
About the fecal
transplant.
She basically had 6, and then she ran out of money, and the effects lasted 6 months to the day, practically.
Okay.
And then just didn't last. So
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's being studied for certain GI infections where it's a great treatment, and then possibly for certain gut diseases like ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease. I think we don't have enough research to know if it's just helpful for other conditions. So it's too early for me to really recommend that to most people. So. Okay, go ahead.
I noticed you didn't mention
Ghee? Oh, yeah, I mean, ghee is hugely beneficial. Yeah, it's a good source of butyrate, so one of the short-chain fatty acids. Yeah, and providing essential fats for the gut to heal. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of ghee, so absolutely, I think that's essential. Kombucha, yeah, I mean, it's one of the fermented foods, but, it's a lot of people don't tolerate it, very strong. So I use a lot of caution when recommending that because, that those properties are very acidic as well, yeah.
If I missed this, how long does each of your steps take?
Oh, good question. Yeah, so the entire process, I say like 1 year or minimum. And so minimum 2 months per stage is approximately what I would say. And then, you tailor it to the patient depending on like severity and symptoms and those kind of things. But yeah. Yes.
I people who talking about circadian rhythm, they truly only start functioning at 9 o'clock.
Yeah, at night.
At night.
Yeah.
And so trying to reverse that is just, and they do have gut issues, obviously they have gut issues.
Right.
Generally insomnia as well.
Yep.
And I've tried a few things, but I can't seem to get them out of this.
Well, that's a great question because studies have shown that about 1 in 4 people have a different circadian rhythm. So these are like the night owls, the people who kind of awaken at night and become alive at night. And that is probably genetic. You're not going to, depending on the person, but you may not. You're probably not going to be able to change that. So that's where I would say you have to kind of work with their own, their own circadian rhythm, which they've studied like about 1 in 4 people have that phenotype where they're really active at night, and in those cases, the traditional the traditional routine is probably not going to work for them. You have to come up with a modified version that's specific to their later schedule, and it could still work for them, but they may not be able to change that. But maybe they don't have to. They can work within that and still heal.
These days where GM food is so extensive and invisible, would you regard it as a toxin, or would you regard it as a extra gluten created substance?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that with GMO foods, I think that it's unclear whether they're safe, and so I'm always a fan of using caution. So I recommend my clients to try to avoid it if they can. And in the U.S., organically certified food must be free of GMOs. So if they're eating organic, you get the benefit of avoiding GMOs and avoiding pesticides and stuff as well. So at least in animal studies, there is some evidence that GMO foods harm the microbiome specifically. So I think plus other toxic effects. So it's more concerning to me, and so I'm definitely recommending people to avoid GMO foods in
There
general.
also seems to be a common belief that a lot of, or perhaps all gluten allergies and wheat allergies are not caused by wheat at all.
Mhm.
They're caused by the use of glyphosates and
Yes, yeah, right. Yeah, I think that's probably true. You know, I think it's probably not all people who are sensitive to gluten, but probably a good chunk of them are reacting to the other things, the glyphosate and the other things in wheat. So it goes back to the issue about food supply, you know, just our food supply. I think your food supply in Europe is actually better than our food supply in the US, you know, like this, but it's not saying much, but, you know, so, yeah. So, all right, well, thank you all.